Hello and welcome back to the Developing Solutions with Sitecore Print Experience Manager video training series. In this video, we'll be continuing some of the advanced PXM development concepts. So we're going to cover custom parsers, and a parser is something that the PXM transformation engine uses to transform code that's coming from rich text and place elements on the page. And so there's a number of parsers out of the box, image parsers, HTML node parsers, table parsers. And if we look at the transformation engine, we can see how those are used by default and how and why we need to make a custom image parser as well as a custom code parser. So let's go look back at our document in InDesign and we'll discuss why these two things are necessary in our project. So we're back here in InDesign, and if we look at some of the body text that's flowing from the rich text fields in the articles, you can see that there's a number of the images on the page that are too large for our printed page. This is sort of a fairly small kind of half-page booklet more than an actual book. And so in this case here, the design itself is too small to accommodate our images. And what we want to be able to do essentially is to shrink these images so that they fit correctly in the text frame and that they in turn scale correctly in the text frame as well. And so that's what we want to do with our custom image parser, is to properly handle images so that they're placed nicely on the page and they don't overflow out onto the page and just look bad or get cut off in our output. So that's the first thing that we're doing. The second thing that we're doing is we'll go down and look at one of our subsequent articles here, and we can see in this case here we're getting this strange behavior that a flow just keeps going and going, or it sort of ends, and sometimes we're not seeing markup. And the reason is because some of the content on the page is not using proper line returns. And so what we're going to do is we're going to, in the transformation engine, create a new transformation element called pre, and then within that pre element transformation, we're going to set a custom renderer which will allow us a little bit more control in the formatting. And we know that this pre element is used because if we go to a Launch Sitecore article, such as creating a list control, and we look at some of the text here, we can see that there's a number of code elements here. And if we look at the HTML for creating the markup, this is using this pre element. And pre basically just uses essentially it's an HTML command that basically says use the formatting as it is, and that includes even spacing. And so right now what's happening is PXM is looking at this OL class and this LI, and it's rendering these things out as lists. So when we are seeing code on the page, we are seeing it as lists, and that's really not what we want. We don't want to see line numbers on our document. What looks good here is really nicely classed out with CSS. It doesn't look as good in our document. I really just want to see the underlying HTML. So we're going to create a new transformation element off of this pre element, and then we're also going to apply a custom renderer on top of that. So let's actually go down to our transformation engine within our Print Studio settings. So that's under Modules, InDesign Connector, Transformations. And if we look at our image parser, you can see here that it is referencing a type. And so our first step is basically to make a copy of this and reference our custom image parser instead. And we're going to do basically the same as what we do for our custom renderers. We're going to inherit from the default PXM image parser, but then we're going to insert our own code to do some height and width resizing. And then we're also going to set some fit styling correctly. So it's really, again, a two-part operation. We're going to go to Visual Studio. We're going to put our code in place and compile that. And then we're also going to add a new definition item here. And then lastly, modify our default transformation set so that instead of using the out-of-the-box image renderer, we want to use our custom image renderer. So let's go to Visual Studio now. So first things first, I'm going to create a new folder under our PXM folder, and I'm going to call this Parsers. And then within that, I'm going to add that new parser. And we'll take a quick look at that. So basically here we are inheriting the HTML node parser, and there's a few things here that we need to include now in our project entirely. So unlike our renderers, we are now starting to dive into HTML as well and starting to work with node attributes. So we're going to include the HTML agility pack as well as Print Studio configuration in our references. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. We will browse to, again, our PXM training, and there's HTML agility pack, and then also we want sitecore.printstudio.configuration, and we will add those references, and at that point our references should line up nicely. And so what we're doing here is when we're creating our inline element, we're doing a couple things. I'm hard coding a few values here for the max width and max height, and these are really coming from that document that was provided to us by Nonlinear. And then at this point, basically, I'm just doing a resize. If the height is or the width is higher than the height or the width that's defined, then shrink things down and shrink the height or the width accordingly. And the last thing that I'm doing is I'm fitting the content to the frame. So basically, I'm shrinking the frame, and then the content just snaps to that new frame size. It is fairly straightforward. So I'm going to go ahead and compile that, and then at that point add that new parser into my definitions, and basically add that to my default transformation set as well, and then put that into play. Alright, so we've created this new custom image item. It's basically a copy of our existing image parser. The only difference is that it's referencing our type for that custom image parser that we've inserted. Next, we've gone to our default transformation set and removed the image parser, the default one, and we've added our custom image parser. So the results now, when we go back to InDesign, is that any image that we see is now resized so that it's the same width as the text frame that it is an inline element of. And so that basically resizes all the elements on the page, which is exactly what we're looking for. So next we're going to do the same for our pre-parser. We're going to create a new pre-parser element, and we're going to put that into play as well, and that'll affect some of the later articles that have a lot more code on them, so some of the more advanced ones. And so once we do that, that'll put that into effect. And then the next thing I'm going to do is basically set up the document so that the flows are correct. Right now we're seeing a little bit of mismatch for how the flows are actually being rendered out, and we need to do that for some of the more advanced steps later on. But again, I'll just do that in the background, and we'll start to see this start to flow correctly, and we'll see the document really as it's nearing its final and most useful form. So we've put that custom pre-renderer in place, and we can see now that pre-code is now being outputted with the code paragraph style, which is Courier, which is a nice mono-spaced font, meaning that every letter takes up the same amount of width. Very useful for code and ensuring things line up correctly. Another thing that we did was set the quotations to use code-based quotations. Normally InDesign will take quotes and do things like curly quotes, which looks nice from a typographic point of view, but obviously when you're displaying code on the page, you don't want curly quotes, you want real quotes. You want to be able to select this and actually drop this in and have this work. So that's what we've done with that pre-parser there. So And if we look at the code, all it's doing is as nodes are being parsed and we're receiving text nodes from the HTML parser, we're simply inserting a special character, which is type 10, which is a line return. And so all that's doing in our document is line returning this stuff, because what's happening is as we're iterating through the lines in our HTML, InDesign is taking all of that and just making that into C data, which has no formatting on it whatsoever. And so by adding these line returns, then instead of this being one long line of text, which basically pushes the flow out because it continues flowing right, we're inserting line returns which do that. And by putting it on our pre-parser, it means that it's only happening with code. It's not happening for any other elements on the page, and so we're not worried about too much of our other text being blown out. This is just being done on code, and so that's then effective. And so we now have a really nicely formatted document, has a lot of good code in place. All the code looks like code, all the images are properly sized, everything else works well. And so at this point we can now start to take this and do some personalization on this, because it's basically in a complete state. In the background, I've done a few other little changes. I've updated the master document to set styles correctly. We now have our flows flowing correctly. And so that was done by basically making a new spread in the master, so that if we start with page or format C here, which starts lower down on the page, for our table of contents, you can see we then flow into the D master, which is a newly created one, which has these text frames that take up the whole page. And so that's what we're doing, is it basically created a new spread in order to flow from different layout types. And so that's it. So a few minor changes, but a lot of the code is the same, and we can now see that our custom image parsing code is working. And so that puts that into the text frame with the correct width, and our custom pre or code parsing code is working as well. So we now have code flowing properly in our document. And so that's it for custom parsers. So we'll now move on to some of the other advanced topics like personalization and like doing workflow in PXM.